Well, good day, everybody. I'm Russ Reed, and I'm the Executive Director of the National Center for the Biotechnology Workforce here at Forsyth Tech in lovely downtown Innovation Quarter, Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And I'm really pleased we have a special edition of SciTech today. And with me is our media tech extraordinaire, Sean Killebrew. Sean, how you doing?
Doing great, Russ. Always good to be here.
Great. And Sean, we have a really special guest today because we have Dr. Stephen Bauer, who's a Regulatory Science Affairs Program Officer at the Institute for Regenerative Medicine, what we call Wfirm here. And Dr. Bauer, welcome to SciTech.
It's so good to be here with you this morning, and thank you for the invitation.
Well, I really enjoyed our preamble today and found out that you and Sean have something in common. Why don't we just talk about that for a second before we get into the major questions here? So I think what's common is music, right?
Absolutely. I discovered Sean is a musician, and I'll let him say exactly what he does, but I also am a singer and a trumpet player in a brass quintet. It's a big, rich part of my life. I don't know how I would get through the rest of it without it, but music is awesome.
I'm also a singer, and I play drums in a couple of bands, and I feel the exact same way. I don't know where I would be without music. And we have a mutual love of the band Chicago, so that was fun.
That's right. As a trumpet player, Chicago has some awesome brass parts, so love
Excellent. Sean, I think you've got a question for Dr. Bauer.
I do. Dr. Bauer, you recently retired from the FDA after an extensive and fabulous career. Can you tell our audience, one, what is the FDA? And two, what did you do there?
Yeah, so first of all, 31 years, I was never bored. I was always challenged. I loved working for the FDA. And I'm very excited to this new part of my career. The FDA is a regulatory agency. FDA stands for Food and Drug Administration, so it has a large spectrum of responsibility. But those responsibilities come from Congress, and the United States Congress says we need to protect the public health and enhance the public health by making sure we have high quality food, drugs, cosmetics, devices, all of which impact people's health. And my part of the FDA dealt with what I think are very novel, new types of modes of therapy, broadly captured under the term regenerative medicine. But that includes cell therapy, gene therapy, tissue engineering, things like 3D bioprinting and stem cell biology. It's an absolutely fascinating and challenging area these days. And I think that's the next frontier and the next medicine that will have a huge impact on public health. So my job there was multifaceted. I was a branch chief, so I had a lot of administrative duties. I had about between 20 and 25 people in my group at any given time, ranging from other scientists, review regulators, principal investigators, to postdoctoral, high school, post-baccalaureate researchers. So in my job, the primary duty was to oversee submissions that came in the door from all these entrepreneurial sponsors in the field of regenerative medicine who wanted to try new things, like a new gene therapy for a new disease. For instance, cystic fibrosis or severe combined immunodeficiency, or they wanted to do a tissue engineering project for something like replacing or repairing bone or skin. And all of these things, we were sort of applying the regulatory framework to that and trying to help our sponsors understand the scientific challenges, the regulatory challenges to get those things from a discovery at the bench side to the bedside. And that's it's a challenging process. It's, we're seeing more and more success in the arena of regenerative medicine, which I'm personally very gratified by. But so not only was I overseeing the submissions where we had to make sure what people were proposing to put into our patients was safe, we had to make sure that, all the understanding of how you get from a beginning clinical trial to licensure was imparted to our sponsors. But we basically had to look at the quality of all the data that was submitted to the FDA and make sure we thought, yes, this could go into people without exposing them to unreasonable risk. And then as things progressed and there was success in a clinical trial, we helped them translate into showing not only was it safe, but it was effective. So that was the regulatory part of the job. The other thing was policy. So I mentioned regulations that Congress puts in place, and then what federal agencies like FDA do is interpret that policy or that regulation into policy. So I was involved in that, and many of my colleagues at FDA are involved in that. For instance, I was part of the policy team that did a guidance document for industry on how you what scientific regulatory elements you need to present to the FDA for a cell therapy at the beginning and all the way through the process. So that's a policy development job. And then another part that really got my creative juices going every day was I also did research. And like I mentioned, in my branch, there were 5 principal investigators and their support staff. My group in particular looked at how do you measure something about a stem cell that is going to by nature change while you manufacture it. By nature, it responds to its environment. You're changing the environment when you take it out of the body and put it into manufacturing, and then you put it back into the body. And understanding the complexity of cell behavior is quite a challenge. It's an important thing for the field. So that part of my job was absolutely fascinating, an important part, and as I said, to me, a precious part of the endeavor. So I think that's in broad brushstrokes what I did at the FDA for 31 years.
Steve, thank you for serving us at the FDA. I used to be on the other side. I was with large pharma, and really enjoyed our interactions with FDA. And during my time, it was rather novel antiviral therapy for particularly in HIV. And without those great discussions with FDA, I don't know if we would have got as far as we did, as quickly as we did. So I want to thank you. But my question now is, okay, so FDA is behind you now, and you're at Wfirm. What is your position? Can you describe it to us? And how does a regulatory science affairs officer fit into the Wfirm mission?
Yeah, so my title is Chief Regulatory Science Program Officer. And again, my job here is multifaceted, and I look at it as at the core of translational medicine, which is getting things through that process from discovery to the bedside, and then to a licensed product that can be distributed. But I think the mission here at Wfirm is to improve patients' lives through regenerative medicine. And that's basically what I was supporting at the FDA, sort of at the other end, but it's similar here. I'm now exposed to and helping people with more of the entrepreneurial beginnings of that process when the discoveries are just being made and people have dreams and aspirations of bringing those into the clinic. But I've seen the nuts and bolts of how that translational works from the regulatory side. So I can help people understand what is the science behind the regulations that they need to meet. And I've done that both on the research side and interpreting that in, the context of regulatory submissions. Like for potency, when you have a cell that potentially could go into the body and expand, that's different from a drug. And so how do you measure potency at the beginning? Many people think of potency as the doctor knows how much to give a patient. And, that's not too far off the technical regulatory mark, but it's an important thing to understand and grapple with when you're developing a cell therapy. The same could be true for certain kinds of gene therapy. So my job, which is I'm just really excited about this new position, is to sort of be at the forefront of those entrepreneurial, new, novel insights and help people translate that, through the clinic and so on. So I'm part of the translational core here, people really involved in making some of these new products. I'm part of the Regenerative Medicine Developmental Organization, which is, helping understand new analytical and laboratory techniques that can support regenerative medicine. But again, I bring this perspective of having seen from the other side where the goalposts are, what you need to get your product through that whole process and get over the goal line. So I'm excited about this new job and really gratified to be here.
Dr. Bauer, what kinds of jobs are there in this regulatory science affairs area?
Yeah, so that is also a wide spectrum, a gamut of jobs, if you will. I think if I haven't said it before, FDA is science-based. The whole translational process is science-based. So science is at the core, but that can be understood in many ways, if you will. So there's a lot of need for people who understand the meticulous process of growing cells and doing that sterilely, so you don't have cells that potentially could, infect a patient with a virus or a bacteria. And of course, there are tests for products, but doing that successfully, people need to understand the meticulous nature of those processes. And so growing cells is just one of them. And then there's all the different new analytical technologies that are being brought to bear. And one of my other hats at FDA, I ran what we call a flow cytometry core. And flow cytometry is the method by which you understand what's on the surface of a cell, and people define cells by what's on the surface of the cell. And so flow cytometry is a core technology. As long as flow's been around, as much as it's used, there are still scientific challenges about how to conduct the experiments, how to best get the data, and especially if you want to quantify how many of those markers are on a cell. So I was involved in that, but that's another example of a basic core technology that familiarity with that, experience within that, training with that is something that's needed. And I know there are lots of companies out there, lots of academic research places that want to do translational, that need some people in the lab who can do these core technologies. So that to me is kind of a scientific training, if you will. And then on the regulatory side, there are people who need to understand the regulations and help translate those within the context of the translational endeavor, whether it be with a company or an academic institution, or like here with the translational core. There's also some need for people who, are going to work in the legislative arena and maybe help adjust and understand the challenges that regenerative medicine brings, and be able to propose and look at different ways to frame our regulations. So the regulations mostly came out of the pharmaceutical small molecule approach, and I think that some of those might well be adjusted in the future to look at things like deploying cell manufacturing more widely to the battlefield, to rural sites, that sort of thing. Those are going to, benefit from some flexibility and change, perhaps, in the regulatory arena. I was involved with NIST and the Department of Commerce and a group called Nimble, which was, has a workforce development program. And I think some of the ideas that I'm talking about here came from my understanding with that group. and the Government Accounting Office has done a couple reports on regenerative medicine, including workforce development. I think they're working on a project like that. So there's a lot of space for people, and a lot of, things that could be addressed by workforce development and training.
Do you think that a two-year college biotechnology graduate with great technical skills would have any issues finding a job?
I don't believe so at all. In fact, I think they would be, in a great position to get a very nice and challenging and interesting job. And I think, if they understand the goalposts that I was just describing, I think that's really important. I myself haven't done it yet, but I'm helping, and I will be involved in a course, a master's in translational biotechnology here. And what I'm hoping to do is give people a sense of what are some of the regulatory science challenges, how can their training address that, and understanding the whole endeavor at a very high level, getting across that FDA goalpost. So I think, the 2-year degree program, there's plenty of room for people to fit with that in that whole endeavor. I think some of the basic skills that I think are important, I mentioned cell culture. I mentioned analytical technology that's applicable to regenerative medicine. For me, flow cytometry is an important one. I think there's a huge interest in developing sort of real-time imaging and using that to understand cell biology. So some of my research work at FDA, we found that you could predict the amount of biological activity in a cell preparation by looking at the shape and size of the cells as you were manufacturing them. And we could use machine learning and artificial intelligence to model this very complex data and pick out subpopulations of cells, shape and size that predicted that biological activity. So I mentioned that because of the imaging I just mentioned, but also artificial intelligence, machine learning, people who are aware of that and can work in that arena supporting that. And then bioinformatics is a huge area. That plugs into this whole idea of smart manufacturing and using analytical techniques like next generation sequencing. So that's one for you. Quantitative PCR is something else. Those things can generate a tremendous amount of data, and we're able to do that even on the single cell level nowadays. And being able to handle tremendous chunks of data like that and sift out of that, AI and machine learning are going to be, the new way to do that. We'll be able to handle more and more complex data. So I think having an understanding of how that works and being able to support or actually do those things is going to be, very important.
It's as if, you've read the playbook for us. We, as we've worked with Wfirm very closely ever since they got to town, which I think is 2004. And so as the college, we were kind of hooked at the hip, and we're always trying to be in line with what the skill sets are. We're trying to modify the program. We're trying to adapt. We're trying to be in sync with what employers want. And I think the overview that you just gave in the last minute or two hits on all notes if we go back to the music analogy. And so I want to thank you. So I wanted to ask you just, any remaining thoughts? Welcome to Winston, welcome to Wfirm, welcome to our community. Any other thoughts?
I'm just so gratified to be here again. I will say this, that's sort of the beginning end of the translational process. And, at FDA, I was sort of at the other end and trying to help that process, but, from a different side. But I also wanted to, plug the idea that people, would consider working at a regulatory agency or working, as a Congress staff member with somebody who's, wants to develop legislation around regenerative medicine and that sort of thing. We did have trainees at the FDA who went to work at the national academies. So, I think an understanding of regenerative medicine at the nuts and bolts level can open lots and lots of doors. So, but, it doesn't have to be necessarily, working just in a lab supporting things. There are other opportunities that I think in regulatory affairs, policy development, maybe even law. So
I think those are excellent parting thoughts. And I want to thank you, Dr. Stephen Bauer, for coming on today to SciTech. It's just been a delightful dialogue. And Sean, I want to thank you for everything you do for the college. And Dr. Bauer, I want to say to you that as you settle in to our community, I want to give you an open invitation to come on over to the college. Anytime you'd like to come over and see what we have here downtown, which we have the analytical portion of what we do at the college. We have a fabulous lab, and I'd love you to meet my lab coordinator and have a dialogue with him as well.
And if Sean and I can get together and do some music, that'd be fun too.
There you go.
Definitely.
All right.